the first part of this video, I'm going to show you how to hook up a jQuery Ui DatePicker using ASP.NET MVC 3. And in the later part of the video, I'll show you how to add some client-side validation and unobtrusive JavaScript validation. So first up, I'll just give you a bit of a tour of the solution. I've just got a bare bones MVC3 project here, and as you can see on the screen, I've created a person model. This model's going to be the foundation for our date, basically, because it's got a date of birth member. I've got a client script member there, which is going to allow me to pull something in from the web config and have that as a JavaScript constant, but we'll get to that. And then there's a few data annotations there, some attributes, which they'll give us out of the box server-side validation. Moving away from the model, I just wanted to show you a package I pulled in using NuGet. It's the UK ADC HTML attribute provider, and that's really handy provider which gives you composability with regards to attributes that you want to inject into edit templates. So it's basically provides you with more of an enterprisey best practice way of using editor templates. Of course, you don't have to use that. You can just hard code into the editor template, but I've preferred to follow this. Moving on to our controller, not too exciting at this point, so we're just basically creating a model and passing that off to the view. You can see there I've got that method getClientScript, and that is pulling in from the app settings of the web config a date-time format, and you'll see what that looks like in a minute. But the idea being that I assign that to the client script member of the model, and then that enables us to use that and we'll be able to take something that was in the web config and use it as a constant in JavaScript at the client side. Looking at the scripts, in the scripts folder, I've tried to strip out as many unnecessary ones as I could. And so basically, those are all the ones that we will be using. I just want to point out one which I did also download via NuGet. It's this jQuery Ui i18n, and that's the localization script. We won't be using that until the end of the demonstration, but I just want to point out that now, and I grabbed that via NuGet. And moving on to our views, we've got a very unexciting person view, index view at this point, which is just strongly typed to a person model. And the layout page is just, doing its job of being a layout page. But as this is such a tiny thing, it doesn't even warrant really mentioning. But I will quickly just run this to show you what we can expect. Nothing too exciting there. In that white box is where all the action is going to be happening though. Okay, so let's get going. The first thing I wanted to do is, in the app settings of the web config, I want to add this date-time format of DDMM, small mm, year. And as I mentioned earlier, in the home controller, we're going to grab that and we're going to assign that to a variable called client constants date-time format. And we'll then be able to use that a bit later in the script that we're going to create to display the jQuery Ui dates which are selected by the Ui editor. Next up, I want to go to an index, and we're just going to have, again, pretty unexciting stuff, just editors for each of the members, which were scaffold columns, the name and the date of birth. And you can see I've just written out the client script at the very bottom in the script tag, You don't need that type equals text JavaScript anymore under HTML5. But in any case, it writes out the client script, which gives us that date time format constant. The next stop is the global ASAX. And what I'm going to be adding here is the UK ADC HTML provider. So we'll just pull that using statement in, and basically I'll show you how this all fits together in a moment, but the first step is to register for a particular editor template, in this case a data template, and to do this for elements which have a class of isAdate, and isAdate is just a class I made up off the top of my head. You could call it something, or you could call your class something completely different. Now we'll add the edit template. So when you download and install the UK ADC HTML attribute provider, not a mouthful, when you install that via NuGet, you will get all of these editor templates here, which just comes with the package. And I'm now going to add one for dates. And I'm just going to replace that with one I created earlier. And this basically is what we're going to use for the jQuery date Ui picker, and it's using a slightly different date time format to the one that we pull in from the web config. There's a good reason for that, and one of them's got to do with how it's displayed in the text box, and one of them's got to do with how it's displayed after you select it from the drop-down calendar. So you do actually need a slightly different date time format in this editor template than the one that we're going to be using in the jQuery Ui plugin. Okay, so just quickly, before we go hook up the jQuery Ui datetime picker, I just want to run this to show you what we've got so far. We've got our name and date of birth in both of those editor templates, and that date of birth there is using the datetime format which is here in this editor template. Okay, so what we've got now is, if I fire up Firebug, wow, come on. Okay, we've now got this input, and you can see here that that UK ADC HTML attribute provider, from now on I'm just going to call that the custom attribute provider. It's injected an attribute of isAdate, and that's what we configured it to do in the global ASAX. So the way that works, just to explain it a little bit, if we quickly go back to our code, and if we look at that person model, that's got a data type of date on the date of birth, and so the custom attribute provider looks at anything on the model that's a date, and if an editor template is registered for that, it's going to inject that class of isAdate into that. And when we set up the jQuery Ui DatePicker, which we're about to do in a moment, that's going to look for all inputs with a class of isAdate. So we'll do that now. Okay, so I'm going to create a new folder, just call it app, and then I find the easiest way and quickest way is just to copy another JavaScript file in there, rename it to whatever you want to rename it to, and delete the contents, because there doesn't seem to be a nice, easy Visual Studio way of doing it. That's my workflow anyway. And so what we're doing here is in the jQuery document ready function, we're going to look for all of the items that have an isAdate class and call the DatePicker method, which is in the jQuery Ui library. And then we're going to configure the date format to this constant here. And you'll recall from the home controller, that constant comes from our web config, and it's our client script member of the model, which we wrote out in raw here. So that follows the trace back to here, and it'll use that constant to format the date. Now we just need to do a little bit more housekeeping. In the layout, we need to add a couple of CSS files for the jQuery Ui base and the DatePicker themes. Then we're going to add the jQuery Ui JavaScript library itself. Obviously we need that. And right at the bottom, I'm going to add our custom library, which we've written. And so if we now fire that up, everything looks pretty much the same. And as you can see, when we click on the various dates, we get the various outcome that we're after. Now, another thing I'll be looking at next is to add an icon here so that users can click on the icon and that will invoke the drop-down menu. Okay, so we'll go and add that image now. I've gone and added an image into the project here, and that's the one that we're going to use. So first up, I'm just going to quickly create a constants file which will hold a few constants for us. Okay, now what this is going to do is one of the things that we need is a path to that image, and we need to get the root path in JavaScript of the page. So this resolve root path function does that, and it'll assign it to this image's location, and then we'll build the path from there to the image itself. So getting back to the editor, what we're going to see is as we add more features, this editor is going to grow a bit. So I'll just add a bit of code here. And so we can see that we've added a few other properties. So show on basically means that I've set that to both, and that means if they click on either the text box or the calendar image, then the drop-down calendar will display. This is the path to the image, and so it's got that constant image's location appended, concatenated to this path to the calendar GIF. And this button image only, it's just confining the display to a that calendar GIF and not some other sort of other button that can be displayed when you're not displaying a calendar GIF. So the other thing I need to add is in the layout, I need to just add that constant script. And we should be good to go. So there we go. We can see we've got this calendar. If we click on that, we get our drop down, and we still get our drop down if we click in the text box. Not so much. Yes, we do. There's a couple of other properties that we can add to the DatePicker, which are quick and easy and which add some pretty good functionality. I'll just go and add those now and talk you through them. Okay, so we've got here, first one, show button panel. What that's going to do is in the drop down, we'll get a couple of buttons at the bottom. One of those buttons says today, and it doesn't take you to today's date, but it takes you to the actual calendar month, which contains today's date. It also has a done button, I believe, and if you click that, that just closes up the fold down calendar. Constrain input works in concert with the date format property that you see above, and it constrains the input to that property, to that format, sorry. So, for example, if it's a numeral and a slash and a numeral and a slash, etc., you've got to follow that format. It otherwise just won't let you type what you're trying to type in if it doesn't conform to that. The max date, it allows you to set a max date that is choosable from the drop-down menu. So, for example, there I've got +0, meaning it's impossible to select a date in the future. And you can see from my clock down here, I've actually got a dodgy VM here. So the date is showing as the 14th of April 2013. So I'll run that up, and you see here we're down in 1980. If I click today, as I said, it's 14 April 2013 as far as my computer is concerned, and it's taken us to that month. And you can see all of these grayed out boxes here that they're obviously not selectable. So that's what we've achieved there, and this done button just closes up the calendar. It's time to turn our mind to validation now. And first up, I'm going to deal with some server-side validation. I'm going to create an attribute which basically checks that a date is in fact a valid date. So I'm just going to create a folder here called attributes, and in that folder create a class called valid date attribute. And I'm just going to copy in some text here, which I've previously done. What this class is doing is it inherits validation attribute, which has a virtual method which we're overriding here called isValid. And the way the model binder works is that if the date is not a valid date, this value that comes in here has the same value as the datetime.min value. And so I'm returning a value here, a boolean, which is basically just checking whether it equals the min value. And if it doesn't equal the min value, that means we've got a valid date. So I need to do a few other things now to get this happening. First, we're going to use that attribute. So let's go to our model, and on our field which has a date, we will use the valid date attribute. And in our controller, we need to post back to check whether to actually use the validation. So adding another override of the index action method, which is an HTTP post. And then we're going to go to our index view, and I'm going to add a form here. So we're actually posting something back. So pretty much everything here that was there previously is still there. We've now got this validation message for, and that is what's going to write out the text to the screen if the validation fails. And this is just a submit button. And you can see here's the actual start of the form. So that'll output a form. Now, if we go ahead and run that, we'll put in a nonce state, do a post back, and what we should see is some server-side validation. So the 22nd of the 22nd, and we're being told here that that's not a valid date. You can see here that it's picked up that colon, and that colon comes from the model. So you can see here it's just picked up that display attribute there, and it does that automatically. That's something we can fix, and I'll deal with that later when we're looking at the client-side stuff. One thing that we need to do to kick off our efforts in doing the client-side stuff is just to add a couple more things to the server side. And the rationale behind this is that it makes it a little more maintainable. So I'm going to create a new folder called validation. And in that, we're going to have a valid date rule class. And I've already done up a version of that. Valid date rule is inheriting from model client validation rule. And this is effectively going to give us the error message, which will be printed out at the client side. And we've got a key basically, which is going to refer to this particular validation rule. Now we need to go back to the validate attribute, and we need to add something in here. So basically everything is the same, except we're now also implementing the iClient validatable rule, and that's added this method down here, and this method has added to the list of validation rules the one that we just created, the valid date rule, and that will give us the unobtrusive JavaScript on the client side. To implement the client side validation using jQuery's validation plugin, and using some unobtrusive JavaScript, we need to add some JavaScript to our editor file. So I've added here some script which includes this call to the add method of the validator plugin, and that gives it this key, which I've made a property of the client constants object. And the way it works is this function here is what's used to do the validation, and it is meant to return true or false. The value comes from the text box, or what's selected from the drop down, and the date picker has a parseDate method which takes a format and the value, and so it's going to parse that date. If it's an invalid date, it'll throw an exception, and so what we do is we catch that exception here, and then at this point here we check to see whether it's an undefined string or whether it doesn't exist, etc., a few other things. And if that's the case, we'll return false, otherwise we'll return true. Now, there is actually a better way of doing that, and I'm going to come back to that, but we'll leave that for now. Down here is where we do the unobtrusive stuff. So the validator has some unobtrusive adapters, and this piece of text here, it correlates to what we had on the server in the validate rule. So that must match up with that. And the better way to do that would be to set it once in the C# and inject it into the JavaScript. But I won't worry about that at this point. And then we just assign to the rules using this key here, the options.params and the options.message, and that will implement that unobtrusive JavaScript for us. And so we need to now go to the layout view to add the relevant scripts for the validator. And so here's our jQuery validator plugin, and here's the unobtrusive library for that validation. And if we run that, we are going to see something a little bit hinky. You can see when I click on the drop down now that we've got some characters here from an Asian language, which is not part of the regional configuration for Australia. So we can fix that, which I'll go and do now. The library that we're going to use to bring in that regional Australian configuration is this localization library that I mentioned earlier. And we add this little line of code here, which uses jQuery's extend method. And I just got to close a bracket here. And when I run this, I've got to open Firebug. So hit an F5 and that'll clear out the cache. And if I now click on the calendar, we're now seeing what we expect to see. I mentioned earlier that I think there's a better way of doing this than using a try catch. And I don't like the idea of using that exception. It's almost like using an exception for flow control. So there's another library which I'm going to bring in called Moment.js. And Moment.js is an excellent library for parsing and validating JavaScript and all that sort of stuff. Using Moment.js is going to enable us to get rid of this code, which I don't really like, and I'll replace it with much nicer looking code. Now, what we need to recognize here is that Moment.js has its own way of formatting strings, and so you need to put something like that. In fact, even though the documentation has hyphens, I think slashes are fine, and slashes correlate more to what we are seeing on the screen because that's how we've configured our date picker. And so the value is coming in, and we've created a moment object using it and using this format here, and that's going to provide us with this moment object called chosen date, and then we can just call chosen date.isValid on there, and that will give us this variable here which I return. One other thing I do just in some kind of appropriate location is set the language. It probably won't have an impact on this operation here, but I believe that if you're going to be using this library, you should set the correct region info using it. And we then just need to add that to our layout. So we've got that there, and that's going to bring in that moment script. So if we now load up, we can see choosing a date. Now let's go create one that we're not happy with, and you can see it's got that client-side validation straight away there. And if we were to debug through, I'd go to the editor script, and I'll just put a breakpoint here and tab away. You can see that that validates to false. Now I'll just get rid of that breakpoint because it validates on every keystroke, which is annoying. Now that's a valid one, and so if I return that, you can see that's validating to true. So Moment.js just gives us some nice cleaner code in that regard. Just a couple of quick things I realized while I was off camera. We need to add back, when we rebuild this model, the client script property, otherwise we lose our calendar icon, and I imagine a few other things will probably go wrong as well. So on a postback, I mean, ideally on those postbacks you'll rebuild the model in some kind of way. This is just a quick and dirty thing to make sure that nothing goes south in this example. And when I run it, the other thing I wanted to quickly talk about is you've heard me mention the unobtrusive validators a couple of times, the unobtrusive JavaScript. If we take a look at the HTML here, you can see these data-val attributes, which are new in HTML5. So if you're dealing with an old browser, I remember having trouble with IE7, but IE 8 onwards is fine, and all the other modern browsers. You can see that these attributes have been added. So the required data annotation on our model gives us this date of birth fields and is required. And the our custom rule valid date, when we made that custom rule and implemented the iClient validatable interface, we can see our very message that we wrote in C# is actually being emitted here. And so when we do enter in a bad date, we get that message, date has to be a valid date. And that's at the client, and it won't let you do a post until you get a valid date, such as that one there. Now, one of the other things I said I would look at is this date of birth colon here, and we need to get rid of that colon. Well, we don't need to, but it will look a lot nicer if we do get rid of that colon. And so you can see this colon here, it's not looking too good in our validation method message. This feels like a bit of a hack, but I can't think of a better way as yet. And if I do think of a better way, I'll put that on my blog. But anyway, what we can do is get into this. We need to hook into this messages object because that's where it stores the messages. And for our custom one, it was very easy because we're controlling what message goes in there. But with the required one, that's actually something that's built into jQuery Ui. Sorry, not jQuery Ui, the jQuery validation plugin. And so I'd have to dig into that plugin to see the image of it, etc. But we can dig into this array here, and we can say if the required message is set, let's grab a hook on it and replace every colon space with an empty string. And it does work, but as I said, it just feels a little bit hacky because we're kind of intercepting, so you can see there's no colon there anymore. We're intercepting it at the point when we're actually adding a validation rule for something else, a custom validation rule at that. So if there is a better way, I would be very interested in pursuing it, but at this stage, that's all I've got. And that's pretty much the biggest dump I can do, brain dump there, when it comes to the jQuery Ui DatePicker. Cheers.